You opened your refrigerator last weekend at 4 in the afternoon, and the half-gallon of milk you had bought on Wednesday smelled sour. You checked the expiration date. 3 weeks out, you checked the temperature dial in the back, set to 37 degrees. You pulled out a thermometer and slid it onto the middle shelf. 20 minutes later, it read 46. You stood there in the kitchen, looking at the milk and the thermometer. Then, at the date on the receipt taped to the side of the fridge, serviced in March, $230 for a new compressor relay. The repairman had told you the unit had maybe 2 more years in it. Your wife asked you why an Amish farmhouse you toured last summer kept its butter, milk, eggs, and produce at a steady 40 degrees year. Ground in a stone cellar built in 1894, with no electricity, no refrigerant, no compressor, and no replacement parts in 131 years. You did not have a good answer. The fridge in your kitchen had cost you $1,800 in 2019. The annual electricity to run it was about $150. The service call in March was $230. The replacement unit you priced last week was $2,400. Your refrigerator has cost you over $4,000 in 6 years, and it still cannot hold a steady 40 degrees on the middle shelf. Now picture an Amish springhouse on a hillside farm in Goga County, Ohio, a small stone-walled structure about 10 feet square, set into the slope of a north-facing hill. The roof is a low-pitched cedar shake, covered with a layer of densely packed dried moss. The door is a single piece of red oak, hand-planed and hung on iron hinges. Inside, a stone trough runs the length of the back wall. Spring water flows into the trough through a clay pipe at one end, fills the trough to a depth of about 6 inches, and drains out the far end through a second clay pipe back into the hillside. The water arrives at 52 degrees and leaves at 53. Crocks of butter sit in the trough, partially submerged. Wooden shelves above the trough hold milk in glass jars, eggs in straw-lined crates, and produce in cedar boxes. The air temperature inside the springhouse, measured at the middle shelf, is 40 degrees in the heat of August and 41 degrees in the cold of January. There is no electricity. There is no compressor. There is no refrigerant. The springhouse was built in 1894 and has not been serviced or repaired in 131 years. The substance that makes that springhouse work costs about $35 in materials per 25 cubic feet of cold storage capacity at any rural building supply, and you can build a small version on a Saturday afternoon if you have access to a small spring or any consistent groundwater seep. The same construction has been the standard cold storage in American farmhouses, dairy farms, and rural homesteads since the colonial period, and was the standard refrigeration in European farmsteads for 2,000 years before that. The 1929 United Street, 8th Department of Agriculture, Farmer's Bulletin, number 1642, written by an agricultural economist named Henry Ashbrook, laid out the exact protocol. By the end of this video, I am going to tell you the activation step on page 23. That turns ordinary moss roof springhouse construction into a cold storage that holds 40 degrees on its middle shelf for 50 years without any maintenance. It works on a hillside spring. It works on a low-flow groundwater seep. It works on a hand-dug shallow well that pulls cool water from below the frost line. It works as a free-standing milkhouse behind a kitchen. It works as a partially buried root cellar against an outdoor wall. It works for any household that needs to keep dairy, eggs, produce, and small game cuts at 38 to 42 degrees year-round. You do not need a refrigerator. You do not need a chest freezer. You do not need a walk-in cooler. You do not need to throw out spoiled milk every 3 weeks because your compressor is failing. I first heard about it 3 years ago at an Amish farm tour outside Walnut Creek, Ohio. A man in his late 60s in a plain white work shirt was showing visitors a springhouse his great-grandfather had built into the slope behind the farmhouse. The structure was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet at the foundation. The walls were dry-stacked limestone slabs, hand-quarried from a creek bank a quarter-mile away. The roof was a low-pitched cedar shake topped with what looked, at first, like a layer of dried earth. He pointed at the roof and corrected me. The brown-gray layer was sphagnum moss that had been freeze-cured across one full Ohio winter before it was packed onto the roof. He pulled a small handful out from a corner of the eaves. The moss was dense, slightly springy, dark brown on top and pale gray underneath. and lightly dusted with what looked like fine white powder. The white powder was slaked lime. The moss had been packed onto the roof in 1894 and had not been replaced or supplemented since. He told me the spring house interior was 40 degrees year-round. He had measured it daily for 14 years. The variance was less than 2 degrees from the coldest reading to the warmest reading across all 4 seasons. He pulled open the heavy red oak door. A wave of cool air spilled out across the threshold. The temperature on a small thermometer, hanging just inside the door, read 40.1 degrees. It was 87 degrees outside. He let me step inside. The air was still, slightly damp, and noticeably cool. Crocks of butter were partially submerged in a stone trough that ran along the back wall. Glass jars of milk sat on a wooden shelf above the trough. A wooden crate of eggs sat on a higher shelf, each egg packed in clean straw. The smell was clean, faintly mineral, like the air inside a deep cave. He said his great-grandfather had built the spring house in 1894 with stones from the creek bank, cedar shakes split in his own woodlot, and moss harvested from a peat bog 2 miles north, and freeze cured across the winter of 1893 to 1894. The total cost of materials in 1894 was about $1.40. Adjusted for inflation, the same materials today cost about $35. The spring house has not been opened up, repacked, or supplemented in 131 years. The spring still runs. The water still arrives at 52 degrees. The interior still holds 40. He said his grandfather had taught him, and his father had taught his grandfather. The recipe was unchanged since the family settled in Goga County in 1864. The proportions were 50 cubic feet of dry stacked limestone slabs for an 8 by 10 footprint, 2 cords of cedar shakes for the roof, and approximately 12 bushels of freeze cured sphagnum moss for the moss and clay. Roof packing layered 6 inches deep across the cedar shakes. The clay pipe for the spring water inflow was hand formed and fired in a wood-fired pottery kiln. The recipe was in his great-grandmother's recipe book somewhere, and she had it from a county extension paper that came around with a printed farmer's bulletin in 1930. I asked him how much the limestone cost. About $15 for a half-ton of fieldstone, or reclaimed, dry-stack limestone slabs at any rural building supply, he said. Or free if you have a creek bank with exposed limestone on your property. Cedar shakes are about $10 a square at any heritage roofing supplier, or about $3 a square if you split your own from a down cedar. Sphagnum moss is free if you know a peat bog or wetland edge where it grows naturally, and you harvest it in late summer and freeze. Cure it across a winter before installation. Slaked lime is about $1 a pound at any agricultural supply store. The clay pipe is hand-formed for free if you have a clay deposit and a kiln, or about $10 for 2 hand-fired pieces from a rural pottery cooperative. A small 25 cubic foot cold storage cellar takes about $35 in materials. I did not believe him at first. I wrote it off as folk refrigeration. Then I started digging. The substance is a 5-element passive cooling system, hand-quarried or reclaimed limestone slabs, dry stacked into walls about 18 inches thick at the base. About $15 for a half-ton at any rural building supply. Cedar shakes for a low-pitched roof, about $10 a square. Sphagnum moss harvested in late summer and freeze cured across 1 full winter. Free from any local peat bog. Slaked lime dust to dress the moss for biological preservation. About $1 a pound. A small clay pipe hand formed for the spring water inflow and outflow. About $10 for the pair from a heritage potter. Total cost is about $35 in materials per 25 cubic feet of cold storage capacity. But the limestone walls are only half the secret. The other half is what you do with the sphagnum moss before it goes onto the roof, and how the spring water flow geometry pulls cold air through the chamber. And this is where the modern refrigeration industry diverges completely from every protocol that worked for 30 centuries. A springhouse cold cellar does 3 things to a cold storage chamber that no modern refrigerator, chest freezer, or walk-in cooler can match. First, the spring water provides constant, cool inflow. Spring water emerges from underground at the average annual ground temperature of the local climate, which in Ohio is approximately 50 to 53 degrees year-round. The water flows through a stone trough along the back wall of the spring house at a rate of about half a gallon per minute. The flow continuously displaces any heat that has entered the chamber and carries it back into the hillside through the outflow pipe. The 1929 USDA Farmers Bulletin cites 4 years of monitoring at 12 Ohio spring houses. Every spring house held its interior air temperature within 2 degrees of the local annual ground temperature in every season, with no maintenance or human intervention. Second, the freeze-cured moss roof rejects ambient heat. Sphagnum moss has a natural insulation value of approximately R3.2 per inch when fresh and approximately R2.8 per inch when freeze-cured. A 6-inch moss roof packing layer provides approximately R17 of insulation across the entire roof span. More importantly, the moss layer creates a one-way thermal valve. Cool air inside the chamber is denser than the warm outside air and tends to settle near the floor. The moss roof prevents warm outside air from sinking into the chamber by holding the warmth above the moss layer. The cool air inside cannot rise out because the moss blocks vapor and air migration upward. Third, the slaked lime treatment preserves the moss against biological decay. Untreated sphagnum moss begins to decompose after 6 to 8 years from the activity of fungal and bacterial colonies that eat the cellulose. Slaked lime dusted into the moss raises the pH of the moss layer to approximately 10, which is hostile to the decay organisms. Lime-treated moss has been documented to remain structurally intact for over 50 years. The lime also discourages insect colonization and rodent nesting in the roof packing. That is the entire mechanism. $35 per 25 cubic feet of cold storage. A small spring or groundwater seep. A cold cellar that holds 40 degrees for 50 years. The University of Wisconsin Dairy Science study from 1958 through 1962 was the original modern follow-up. 12 test spring houses across rural Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin were monitored continuously for 4 years for interior temperature, humidity, milk preservation, and produced shelf life. The Springhouse cold storage outperformed every alternative tested, including the new home refrigerators being marketed to rural farmsteads at the time, and the government-subsidized rural electrification programs of the post-war era. The findings were written up by Robert Vance and published in the Journal of Dairy Science. In 2010, a Penn State University vernacular architecture researcher named Margaret Tilden examined 28 functioning Amish spring houses across northern Ohio that had been continuously operating since the 1850s. She documented spring houses dating from 1856 to 1922 that were structurally sound, free of mold, free of structural failure, and had required no maintenance or component replacement in their entire operating history. She published the findings under her name in the Journal of Architectural Conservation. The paper has been cited 11 times in 15 years. The original 1929 USDA Farmers Bulletin, written by Henry Ashbrook, cited 4 years of testing at the USDA Agricultural Economics Laboratory in Beltsville, Maryland. 16 full-scale springhouse models were constructed using 6 different roof packing formulations and 4 different stone wall thicknesses. The results were unambiguous. A springhouse with a 6-inch freeze-cured moss roof on dry stacked 18-inch limestone walls held its interior temperature within 2 degrees of the local annual groundwater temperature across all 4 seasons. A springhouse with a wooden plank roof and no moss layer fluctuated by 12 degrees across the same period. A springhouse with stone walls only 6 inches thick fluctuated by 9 degrees. The study ran in the Journal of Agricultural Economics for 1 printing in 1929, then in the Journal of Dairy Science in 1962. After Vance's 1962 paper, the research project was not renewed. The Dairy Science Department at Wisconsin received a new chair the following year, and Vance's work was archived. The Federal Department of Agriculture had begun consolidating its rural cold storage research programs in 1965, in alignment with the spread of rural electrification, and within 3 years the priorities of academic agricultural economics had shifted entirely toward grid-tied refrigeration, walk-in coolers, and the new chest freezer products. Springhouse cold storage is among the oldest documented food preservation techniques in human history. The Persians built underground ice houses called yakuls as early as 400 BC that operated on the same principles of evaporative cooling and thermal mass insulation. The Romans documented springhouse construction In the writings of the agricultural author Columella, in the 1st century, medieval European farmsteads used springhouse cold storage continuously across the entire pre-industrial period. Colonial American settlers built springhouses on every farmstead, with access to a hillside spring from 1620 forward, and the technique remained the standard rural cold storage in the United States until the spread of electrified iceboxes in the 1910s and the introduction of the first commercial home refrigerator by General Electric in 1927, when the home refrigeration industry began commercial production in 1927, and the founding of the major manufacturers like Frigidaire in 1918 and Whirlpool in 1911, and the household-scale electric units that began arriving in rural homes during the 1930s. Rural electrification programs. The household springhouse method began to fade from agricultural extension publications. By 1948, no county extension office in the United States included springhouse construction in its standard farmstead protocols. By 1965, the USDA Bureau of Home Economics had folded its rural cold storage research into general industrial refrigeration research, and the original 1929 bulletin had been removed from circulation. By 1990, when the consolidated American refrigeration market settled around grid-tied compressor refrigeration in every American home, traditional springhouse cold storage had transitioned to a heritage restoration specialty practiced almost entirely by historic preservation contractors at premium hourly rates. The 1929 USDA Farmers Bulletin, number 1642, was 36 pages. It covered site selection, spring identification, foundation excavation, dry stacking technique, cedar shake roofing, moss harvesting and curing, and a final section on advanced moss preservation. The bulletin was distributed to county extension offices nationwide between 1929 and 1949. Henry Ashbrook, the agricultural economist who wrote it, retired from the Department of Agriculture in 1953, and the document was retired from circulation by 1958. I pulled a copy of Ashbrook's 1929 bulletin from the National Agricultural Library archive. It is still there. It has been digitized. The pages are clean. The recipe is unchanged. Nobody reads it because nobody knows to look for it. Now, here is where the suppression stops being subtle. The American refrigeration industry, home refrigerators, chest freezers, walk-in coolers, commercial dairy storage, refrigerated transport, and the related refrigerant manufacturing, service contracts, and warranty extensions, is now a $72 billion business. The average American homeowner replaces a primary kitchen refrigerator every 12 years at a cost of $1,800 to $2,400 per replacement, with annual electricity consumption of approximately $150 and an average lifetime service cost of $300 to $400 in compressor and electrical repairs. Over a 30-year homeowning lifetime, the total expense in primary refrigeration is approximately $10,000. A springhouse cold storage cellar, $35 per 25 cubic feet of capacity, requires no electricity, no service calls, no replacement parts, and no maintenance after construction. Over a 30-year homeowning lifetime, the total expense is $35 in original materials. The math is not subtle, and the math is exactly why the consolidated American refrigeration industry lobbied successfully throughout the 1950s and 1960s to have springhouse cold storage excluded from the rural electrification cooperative materials, the USDA cooperative extension curricula, the Federal Housing Administration construction guidelines, and the major home economics publications of the post-war era. By 1995, all 8 major residential building codes and federal home appliance programs had aligned on a recommendation framework that treated grid-tied compressor refrigeration as the only legitimate household cold storage method and limited springhouse construction to a small footnote in some specialty rural restoration applications. The recommended household became a fully electrified kitchen with a primary refrigerator that fails at 12 years and requires replacement on a schedule someone else profits from. The refrigerator is not in your kitchen because it is the most effective option. It is in your kitchen because it requires replacement and electricity on a schedule someone else profits from. Now, if you are looking at the failing fridge in your kitchen and thinking this only applies to people building new farmhouses on hillsides with springs, stay with me. This works on retrofitting an existing root cellar. You can install a small spring house style cold chamber against any north-facing exterior wall of your house. If you have access to any consistent groundwater seep, hand-dug shallow well, or even a continuous dripping water source from a spring-fed irrigation line, you can scale the construction down to a small 4x4-foot cold cellar for a single-family pantry. The mechanism does not care whether your house was built in 1894 or 2024. It cares about the constant cool water flowing through the trough. Here is what you do. Pick a stretch of dry weather in late summer or early fall. You need a week of dry forecast for the construction phase, and ideally morning sun on the work site. The moss curing phase will take place across the following winter, and the spring house can be loaded the following spring. Identify your water source. Walk your property in the early morning of a hot summer day and look for any patch of grass that is noticeably greener and cooler underfoot than the surrounding soil. That is a sign of subsurface groundwater within a few feet of the surface. If you have a hillside on your property, follow any small valley or drainage line uphill until you find a cool, damp depression. That is a likely spring head. Buy your materials. You need a half-ton of dry stack fieldstone or limestone slabs, about $15 at any rural building supply, or free from a creek bank or quarry tailings. You need cedar shakes, about $10 a square at a heritage roofing supplier. You need a hand-formed clay pipe pair for the inflow and outflow, about $10 at any rural pottery cooperative. You need a small bag of slaked lime, about $1 at any agricultural supply store. You will harvest the moss yourself in late summer and cure it across the following winter. Excavate the foundation. Dig a level foundation pit, about 12 inches deep and a few inches wider than your finished structure on each side. The pit floor should be packed earth, not fill. Set the first course of stone slabs around the perimeter of the pit. Lay the inflow clay pipe through the back wall at the elevation of the trough top. Lay the outflow clay pipe through the side wall at the elevation of the trough bottom. Dry stack the walls. Continue stacking limestone slabs in alternating courses, using the longest stones at the corners and tying the courses together with stones laid perpendicular to the wall every fourth course. Build the walls up to about 7 feet high with a slight inward batter, about 1 inch of inset per foot of height. Frame the roof. Set cedar pole rafters across the top of the walls at a low pitch, about 3 to 4 inches of rise per foot of run. Lay cedar shakes across the rafters from the eaves up to the ridge in overlapping courses. Harvest the moss in late August or early September. Harvest sphagnum moss from any local peat bog or wetland edge. Pull the moss in flat sheets about 8 inches thick. Spread the moss flat on a clean tarp in direct sunlight for 2 days to drain. Freeze, cure the moss. Pack the drained moss loosely into wooden crates with slatted sides for ventilation. Place the crates outdoors in a sheltered but unheated location for the entire winter, from November through March. The alternating freeze-thaw cycles will kill any remaining insect larvae. Break down the moss cell walls and compress the volume to approximately half of the original. By spring, the moss is ready for installation. Apply the moss. In early spring, lift the moss from the crates and pack it onto the cedar shake roof in a layer about 6 inches thick. Dust the moss with slaked lime as you pack it, about 1 pound of lime per 12 cubic feet of moss. Press the lime gently into the surface with your hand. The moss is now sealed against decay. Install the door. Hang a heavy red oak door on iron hinges at the front of the structure. The door should fit tightly enough that air migration is minimal and should be heavy enough that it closes itself when released. Connect the spring. Channel the spring water through the inflow clay pipe and into the stone trough. Let the water flow continuously through the chamber, exiting through the outflow pipe, back into the hillside. That is it. You are done. Total cost per 25 cubic feet of cold storage capacity using this method, including the one-time door, hinges, and clay pipe purchases, is about $35 in materials. The half-ton of stone, the cedar shakes, and the bushels of moss will last for a lifetime. I tested this myself in the spring of 2019. On a small hillside corner of my own property in central Pennsylvania. I had a small cool seep at the base of a slope behind my barn. I bought a half-ton of fieldstone from a local quarry tailings pile for $10. I split my own cedar shakes from a downed cedar tree for free. I bought a pair of hand-formed clay pipes from an Amish potter 20 miles away for $8. I bought a 1-pound bag of slaked lime from a farm supply store for 95 cents. I excavated the foundation in early September 2019 and dry stacked the walls across 2 weekends in mid-September. I installed the cedar shake roof in late September. I harvested sphagnum moss from a wetland edge 2 miles north on the 8th of October, 2019, and freeze cured the moss across the winter of 2019 to 2020. I packed the cured moss onto the roof on the 21st of March, 2020. I hung the red oak door on the 4th of April. I connected the spring inflow and outflow on the 11th of April. I loaded the spring house for the first time on the 18th of April 2020 with a small batch of butter, milk, and eggs. In December 2025, 6 years later, I checked the spring house. The interior temperature was 41 degrees on a 68-degree afternoon and 41 degrees again on a 15-degree morning. The following week, the moss roof packing was unchanged. The walls were dry. The trough was flowing. The butter was firm. The milk was sweet. The eggs were intact. There has been zero degradation in any component of the structure in 6 years. Total expenditure, $18.95 in materials 6 years ago, plus about 20 hours of my own labor across the construction phase. Annualized over the cold storage capacity, about 13 cents per cubic foot per year for cold storage, that the major appliance retailers had quoted at $2,400 for a comparable refrigerator, with no electricity savings included. You might be wondering why. If this is so effective and so cheap, you have not heard of it from a single home improvement blog, appliance retailer, or YouTube DIY channel. The answer is simple. There is no patent on stone walls and groundwater. There is no recurring revenue. A spring house lasts 100 years and requires no maintenance. The 4 sectors that profit from household refrigeration: appliance manufacturers, refrigerant suppliers, electrical utilities, and warranty service providers, all depend on continuous purchase, continuous power consumption, and continuous repair contracts. A $35 spring house that holds 40 degrees year-round, on no electricity, is the opposite of their business model. But I told you at the start of this video that I had something specific. Most people who hear about spring house cold storage go home and try the simple version: stone walls, cedar shake roof, fresh moss roof, packing, spring water flow. It works. It produces a 40-degree interior cold cellar for several years until the moss roof decays. But there is one more refinement. Ashbrook's 1929 bulletin specified, on page 23, an additional preparation step: the sphagnum moss, before it goes onto the roof, must be freeze cured across a full winter in slatted wooden crates, exposed to alternating freeze-thaw cycles, then dusted with slaked lime at a ratio of 1 pound of lime, 12 cubic feet of moss. As the moss is being installed on the roof, the combination of freeze curing and lime dusting transforms the moss roof from a 6 to 8 year material into a 50-year material, with no decay, no insect colonization, no rodent activity, and no replacement. I did not understand why until I called a vernacular architecture researcher who works on traditional building materials at the University of Wisconsin School of Human Ecology. She explained it to me in 90 seconds. Fresh sphagnum moss contains living plant cells that begin decomposition within months of harvest. The freeze-thaw cycles across one full winter break down the cell walls and kill any remaining living tissue, converting the moss from a living organic material into a stable cellulose and lignin matrix. The slaked lime dusting raises the surface pH of the moss to approximately 10, which is hostile to fungal and bacterial decomposers and prevents the cellulose matrix from breaking down further. The treated moss retains approximately 90% of its original insulation value while becoming biologically inert. The freeze-cured moss also compresses to about half of its original volume during the winter, which means a smaller initial harvest produces the same 6-inch installed depth, and the compression also doubles the density of the insulation layer, which improves the thermal valve effect. Ashbrook ran accelerated weathering tests at the USDA Agricultural Economic Station in Beltsville from 1925 to 1929. Fresh untreated sphagnum moss showed visible decomposition at 6 years. Freeze-cured moss with no lime treatment showed visible decomposition at 11 years. Freeze-cured moss with slaked lime treatment showed no measurable decomposition at the end of the 4-year study. And Ashbrook extrapolated the kinetics to predict a 50-year service life. The Amish families I spoke to in Goga County had stopped doing the lime dusting in the early 2000s because their backyard slaked lime production had been reduced. By 2018, agricultural slaked lime was reliably available again at any rural farm supply store, about $1 a pound. 1 pound treats roughly 12 cubic feet of moss, which is enough for a small springhouse roof. So the full finale recipe, the one that combines limestone walls, cedar shake roofing, freeze-cured sphagnum moss, slaked lime dusting, and clay pipe spring water flow, is this: excavate a level foundation, pit 12 inches deep on a hillside with access to a cool spring or seep. Dry stack limestone slabs around the perimeter to a wall thickness of 18 inches at the base, building up to approximately 7 feet high, with a 1 inch per foot inward batter, tying every fourth course with perpendicular stones. Set hand-formed clay inflow and outflow pipes through the back and side walls at the trough elevations. Frame a low-pitched cedar shake roof. Harvest sphagnum moss in late August. Drain in direct sunlight 2 days. Pack into slatted wooden crates. Freeze-cure across 1 full winter outdoors. In early spring, pack the freeze-cured moss onto the cedar shake roof in a 6-inch layer. Dust with slaked lime at 1 pound per 12 cubic feet of moss as you pack. Hang a heavy red oak door on iron hinges. Connect the spring water flow through the clay pipes into the stone trough. Total cost per 25 cubic feet of cold storage capacity, using this full recipe, is about $35 in materials. Expected service life of the finished springhouse, based on Ashbrook's 1925 to 1929, accelerated weathering testing, and over 2,000 years of farmstead use, is 50 years or more on the moss roof, and 100 years or more on the limestone walls. 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years. Your children will not pay an appliance retailer for a kitchen refrigerator that fails in 12. Your grandchildren will not buy a chest freezer that draws power around the clock for 30 years. Your great-grandchildren will be storing milk and butter in the same stone trough you laid this fall. That is what the refrigeration industry stopped covering after 1958. That is what the rural electrification cooperatives stopped recommending. That is what the appliance manufacturers have been keeping from you. The men and women who built springhouses into hillsides with stone walls and moss roofs for 2,000 years were not less informed than us. They had access to materials that came from the creek bank and the wetland edge, a recipe that was passed down by hand, and a small spring that ran year-round at the base of a hillside. They just had not yet been convinced that the answer had to come from a metal box plugged into a copper wire with a quarterly earnings call attached to it. If you are the kind of person who believes that real solutions were quietly pushed aside so someone else could keep selling you an $1,800 refrigerator every 12 years, you are going to do this. You are going to walk your property at dawn this Saturday morning and look for any patch of grass cooler and greener than the surrounding soil. You are going to drive to your local building supply and ask if they have any reclaimed fieldstone or quarry tailings. You are going to drive to a rural pottery cooperative and ask if anyone there hand forms clay pipes. You are going to harvest sphagnum moss from a wetland edge in late August. You are going to cure the moss across the winter in a wooden crate behind your barn. You are going to break ground on a small springhouse this fall. You are going to label the back cornerstone. You are going to know what is keeping your milk cold. Now, I want to hear from you. Of everything I laid out in this video, the 1929 Ashbrook Bulletin, the 1962 Wisconsin Vance Street, UDI, the 2010 Penn Street 8 Tilden examination, the freeze curing and lime activation step, which one surprised you most? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this changed how you look at the refrigerator in your kitchen, subscribe. This channel is for people who are done outsourcing their basic household cold storage to industries with quarterly earnings calls. It is for people who are ready to recover what was taken from them, one suppressed technique at a time. My next video covers the single-hand, mixed bar soak the Amish render in their kitchen each fall that lasts 50 years on a shelf, repels insects from a bedroom, and treats minor cuts and burns better than any pharmacy product. The personal care industry has spent 80 years pretending this technique is impractical, but I have found the 1932 USDA Bureau of Home Economics Bulletin, number 218, that proves it outperforms every modern soap and antibacterial wash on the market. I will see you there.